I want to talk to you about what's going on with Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine and the United States and the conversation that Zelensky had with Trump today, and how that went. It seemed to go better, I think, in terms of the language that's used, better than the one that went with Putin. So let's talk now to Andrew Borene, who's a senior fellow at the National Security Institute at the George Mason University in Washington, D.C. I hope I didn't destroy your name there.
That's fine. It's Andrew Borene. Yeah.
Borene. Right. I was, sorry, I know, because with my name people get it wrong all the time, so I really do apologise. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Look, let's start with that call with Trump and Zelensky. The first time they've spoken since that moment in the Oval Office. The language seemed to be that they got on well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's a much better conversation than the last one, to be certain.
Yeah, couldn't be much worse, could it? We know that Zelensky has been schooled, right? We know that the Brits have taught Zelensky how to speak to Trump, right? How to play to Trump, because he likes a specific language, doesn't he, Donald Trump?
I mean, I don't know the man personally, but I think certainly. Yes, I would agree that it makes sense that, you know, when you speak to the President of the United States, that you address from a kind of a point of deference. And I think that may be how he views it.
OK, well, let's have a look at what the next steps might be then. So the conversation with Zelensky and Trump seemed to go OK, not so well, it would appear, with Trump and Putin, where the word frank was used, a frank discussion, which is never good. But what are the next steps with this? And what, I mean, difficult to answer, but what can we expect from Donald Trump?
You know, like I said, things here are evolving so quickly, and the headlines move pretty fast. So I would say there's a lot of froth at the top in terms of when you try to track these things in terms of what was said in the last hour or the last several days. But my observation and my assessment is that it does seem like there is some significant advancement on bringing both the Russians and the Ukrainians to the table to talk about potential pathways to end the very active and tragically active phase of the war that's resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths on both sides.
But we are looking at a Putin who his part of the ceasefire deal, even before we get to the peace, is that Ukraine shouldn't have any more weapons or any intelligence while they're allowed to completely continue with their land grab. I mean, it seems to be extraordinarily one-sided.
Well, I'm not. I guess another way to look at it might be that we are not in the end phase of negotiations. You know, the conversation with President Zelensky about a week and a half ago, conversation with Putin just yesterday, another conversation with President Zelensky. We still have yet to kind of see active participation from another major power, which would be the European nations, particularly in the wake of an 800 billion euro defense authorization. I can't think of another way to say it. Europe's never talked about rearming and building an organic defense industrial base and, really acting as a concerted alliance, or what Keir Starmer calls a coalition of the willing. So this is a very complex negotiation for all parties concerned, and so I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that this does start moving the needle in conversations. And I don't know in any complex negotiation where both parties show up at the table in the first couple of conversations with a mediator or a third-party arbitrator, or even if they went to court before a judge, where they both come in with their final bargaining position.
No, but to be fair to Zelensky, he agreed to pretty much an unconditional ceasefire in order to get to the peace talks, and Putin didn't. Putin came in with massive conditions to just a ceasefire. In fact, he hasn't agreed to a ceasefire. There is no ceasefire, it would appear.
There were drones launched yesterday.
Yeah.
Again.
Exactly.
My observations, I've been on the ground twice in the last 12 months in Ukraine. I've seen really what I personally assess as terrorist acts by the Russian government in terms of how they are really kind of not sending untargeted drones and untargeted missiles into civilian areas. And it's horrific. That does not mean that I don't think it's important to engage in negotiations and conversation. And like I said, I mean, it's an active, hot war and has been now for years. So I don't know that you can say, hey, neither of these parties or one party's working on it and the other isn't. I guess the free world, and particularly Europe, I think, and I'm a dual resident, a citizen of the U.S. and a resident of the United Kingdom. I spent a lot of time traveling, meeting with Europeans, and like I said, been to Ukraine twice. I love the Ukrainian people, and I think if this creates a pathway in which Vladimir Putin can secure access to Crimea with the land bridge through that territory, and I don't know that that's possible, but I fear if Vladimir Putin can't secure that as part of a negotiated settlement, that this won't end. I don't see how the Russian military, the Russian strategic level advisors would allow their president to walk back from that segment of win. And it's tragic. It's not good. That is sovereign Ukrainian territory, was and remains under international law, sovereign Ukrainian territory that is currently occupied by Russia. But like I said, I don't know where in any of these types of negotiations we have very angry, hostile belligerents where both parties in a negotiated peace, as opposed to kind of a crushing defeat of one side or the other, where they can both walk away from the bargaining table saying, hey, I got everything I wanted.
If you look at
painful to watch.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at what has been taken, let's say 20% of roughly of Ukrainian territory, and as you said, there's Crimea. We've already heard now from Russia that he wants to go down to the port of Odessa. Putin has always wanted Odessa. It's an incredibly vital port. It's incredibly important, and it's incredibly important to Ukraine. So, but if he gets the opportunity in this pseudo half ceasefire to keep pushing forward, then what, and especially I know that Donald Trump thus far is not planning to remove intelligence from Zelensky, and he's not planning. He's helping him find some Patriot missiles, is my understanding. But if Putin had his way, then he can just keep marching. He can just keep going forward, leaving Zelensky without so much as a rock in a sock and a pair of binoculars.
Well, and I guess, we talk a lot about President Putin, President Zelensky, President Trump, and I think more importantly, the Ukrainian people, more importantly, the Russian people who are also suffering, and more importantly, also the Europeans who are going to have to step up and provide actual security guarantees.
Putin won't let them.
Well, of course, Putin doesn't want to let them. That's the point. That's why he's trying to invade. That's why he tried to convince the Zelensky administration to abscond. I actually keenly remember that the American people were prepared, in the news and in the media, to expect Zelensky and his advisors to flee and be a government in exile. They didn't. They stood their ground. Yeah. This is a victory. So it was supposed to end in days with a Russian cakewalk all the way to the borders of Poland, and it didn't. And now we're talking about negotiating a settlement, and it might involve a DMZ. It might horribly be a kind of a frozen conflict like we have in North and South Korea. It might be reminiscent of East and West Germany. But if a significant portion of the Ukrainian people can return, we have millions of displaced persons throughout Europe from Ukraine. If some of them could return to a safe, protected, country sovereign with its own security guarantees and part of a tighter alliance with the European defense sector, right? That wouldn't, I don't know, I can't speak for the Ukrainian people, but I have to think that that is 1,000 times better than what the Americans were talking about, 4 years ago, in the expectation that if the Russians invaded, that there would be no more Ukrainian government other than a kind of a rump state of Russia and Belarus.
But as you'll remember, the same thing happened with Crimea. Right? Everybody just went, well, let them have, come on, it's a funny little knobbly bit, let them have Crimea, they won't be back for more. Putin went, no, I'm not coming back for more. How much do people keep having to give? I mean, looking at some of the ideas that Donald Trump has now got, the mineral deal seems to have gone quiet. Now he's fixated on controlling, buying and owning nuclear and power stations in Ukraine. How much are we expecting Ukraine to give? Minerals, electricity, nuclear, land, lives. How much until the rest of the world is happy and Ukraine just has to put up with it because it's better than the way it is now?
Well, I mean, I would argue that Germany has not yet come to the mat. Taurus missiles are not deploying to Ukraine.
Well, Germany's just had a regime change, a new leader. That's all been sorted out. They haven't got a government.
Yep, and let's be honest, the Europeans have had to step up and start creating a defense industrial base, a mechanism to exert a European identity in this conflict. And it kind of came to a head after the election, but this isn't new. It's been multiple U.S. presidential administrations calling for arbitrary percentage increases, percentage of GDP investment in defense. As a longtime observer of transatlantic relations, I've always questioned why it doesn't move from how much is needed to be spent by Europe, and then you back into that with what is the budget, because Germany can afford more, obviously, than Estonia, right? The Poles can provide more troops than the Swedes. So let's start thinking about it. If I were a European central defense planner or defense minister, I would be very actively seeking to talk to all of my colleagues on the continent and with the UK, because Russia is on the doorstep there. What happens on the continent?
I mean, to be fair, that is what they are now doing, and Trump has forced that to happen. And I think you're right that it needed to happen. But the more immediate thing, I mean, Ursula von der Leyen today was talking about we're going to buy more weapons and more hardware, but we're not going to buy American. So Trump won't be happy about that. It'll be European built. And Ukraine now has become a master builder of weapons as well. So there will be deals to be done there.
And not only builder of weapons, but engineering.
Absolutely.
Right? So they've taken in platforms, drones, UAVs, counter drone technology.
It's amazing.
And so I mean, as a hypothetical example, they get 15 to 20 different platforms, 5 to 10 different types of ground controllers that were not built to be interoperable, and they're making them interoperable. That's called engineering, right? That's not the research, development, innovation phase. That's engineering existing systems to work in an active battle space. Now, I am also a believer that when the conflict settles down, some of Ukraine's best exports will be that type of engineering. And it won't only apply to battlefield technology. That's going to apply to things like energy infrastructure, cyber defense, IT integration. Like, you think integration of massive systems that need to be securely integrated across 30 plus different countries in the continent and the NATO partners. So Ukraine stands to gain huge economic benefits, the sovereign and free component of it, as soon as this can settle down. And so I think to your point on the co-investment, and that's how I've heard it referred to, is co-investment. And if there are U.S. interests on the ground that need to be defended, I think it probably lends itself, given how this administration has shown its interests, that they would then seek to defend those economic interests.
And not Ukraine and not the people of Ukraine. I think the message is pretty awful, to be frank. We'll defend the money, we'll defend but we're not interested in you. It seems to be the message coming out of the US.
Yeah, I can't speak to the kind of the way the message is being delivered, but as a person that advocates very strongly for a free Ukraine, and has spent a significant portion of my life studying hybrid conflict and the types of just below the threshold of war sabotage, espionage activities that the Russians, Iranians, and PLA and Chinese communists are undertaking worldwide. This breaks my heart. However, having an active hot war is not good. So finding ways to bring back Ukrainians that have been separated from their homes for years now, finding ways to reboost an economy in Ukraine that's going to look a lot different than it did before the war, right? When we get to peace, the exports from Ukraine that you and I just talked about, with the engineering talent and the IT talent, with the cyber defense talent, ability to start integrating with the Western world. And there were concerns at the onset of the war about Ukraine's readiness to integrate into EU-style markets, right? And that was a business culture issue. But let's get peace on the ground so that we can get them focused on the business culture, on the integration of transparent capital markets, removing things like corruption from the system. And I'm not saying Ukrainians are corrupt. What I'm saying is that before the war started, that was the conversation about how do you bring Ukraine into the European fold in a mainstream way. And my belief is as soon as we can get to peace, Ukraine's going to be an exceptional powerhouse engine of support for the European continent.
I absolutely agree with you. It's been remarkable watching this is the mother of invention, isn't it? Necessity being the mother of invention. It's been extraordinary. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Andrew Borene there, a senior fellow at the National Security Institute at George Mason University in Washington, D.C.